So in terms of the native Californians' material culture and technology, again, they were hunter-gatherers. Remember, the bow and arrow was introduced late. Acorns are the most important crop. Bands would come together during harvest. And again, this also brings about some other ceremonies, just very similar to the pinyon kind of harvest in the Great Basin. Mechanical solidarity, again, applies here. If everybody's doing the same work, there's a certain level of equality. Remember, when we talk about jobs, usually a lot of times we say the word chief, right? And it has some bearing on things, and it means some monumental thing to us. Well, in reality, chief is just a title. It doesn't, again, the chief in Napa could just be a rooster. So remember, there could be other titles like shaman, right? Like antelope shaman, like different shamans in the Great Basin that have similar status. So a lot of times people probably had different names for different things and all had the same status. They just weren't the people that the missionaries talked to in terms of leader and by name. So again, the structure of egalitarianism and leadership needs to always kind of be in the back of our mind, especially when we start to talk about mechanical solidarity, which is doing the same work basically brings us together and creates inequality among us. We're sharing time, we're sharing the same work. There's no value above anybody else. Stone tool technology, again, everything from obsidian, cherts, quartzite, everything was used, what was available. Again, obsidian was probably the most sought after in terms of stone tool technology. Bones and antler tools were also used for, again, making clothes and punching holes in things. Basketry was very, very big among the California Native Americans and was used for everything, at least the technology of making these baskets. And they were used from creating these things like these granaries that you see in this picture here. This is kind of in the Yosemite Valley. Ultimately, you can make giant baskets, right, which they did. They used them for making cradles, different types of almost clothing with kind of this basketry technology. And then a lot of the baskets were used for cooking. They would make waterproof baskets that then you heat up the rocks and throw the rocks in and create a soup and mush. I may have discussed this prior to. So lots of different technology. Again, it's on the coast, so then we're talking about hooks and harpoons for hunting sea life, those kinds of things as well. Rivers, salmon was important up in the north. So the fishing weirs or the nets, basically the blockades in the river, traps, those kinds of things would all have been included in this. In terms of technology that I've kind of discovered in the archaeological record, at least when I've done the digs, really stone tools kind of are what is left behind. Baskets fade pretty quick. Those things, anytime those types of material culture are buried, they tend to go away and decompose. So some of these things are found, like the pomo baskets are kind of highly sought after. Pomo, Ohlone, it's something depressing. I think there's like 5 Ohlone baskets left that are from this time period, and a lot of them are in museums, right? So you kind of have to do some hunting to find some of these baskets in certain museums. But the basketry culture and technology was definitely important to this group. Religion. No single supreme being, supernatural powers and beings did exist, but there was no single one being. They did not have the Great Spirit concept. The coyote is almost universal among these groups in terms of cosmology and the creation story. Remember Trickster and how does he fit in? Does he bring life? Those kinds of things. These are the different types of ceremonies. World renewal ceremony in the Northwest, which is basically to keep the world in order, keep people healthy, resource productivity, aka the environment, and seeking to prevent disasters. Now remember, this world renewal ceremony would act as like a group collective magic ceremony. Really, you're trying to control that natural world through this ceremony, right? And we have these in current culture, right? There are, I may have talked about this again, this idea of group healing or communal healing, right? Laying on of hands, basically bringing in a supernatural power through a group of people and creating this change in your natural world is very common in humans, the symbolic connection. And the world renewal ceremony would have been part of this process as well. The Tololashi is a ceremony in south of San Francisco, and this really gets into the use of hallucinogenic drugs. And really, we're focused on Datura in this group. Datura is a very, very powerful drug. Right? When I went to school, the anthropologists when they brought this up, they would warn about the kids in the 1960s that thought that they could just go try Datura, as kind of their own initiation, right? They all ended up dead. I think there was 5 students that ended up dead, because they tried to go this route. Remember, this was done with a shaman who knew exactly what he was doing, he or her, and had been passed down for years and years. But this would have been part of a connection to the supernatural world. A lot of times Datura and ayahuasca down in South America are used kind of in this way, this connection to the supernatural world. Datura, again, super, super powerful, and part of this Tolashi ceremony. The Kuksu cult, interesting stuff. In terms of my research, I've done a bunch of research. There's some of these older texts that I've read, talk about like a bringer of culture, a bringer of society, and that it was like an individual who had kind of swept through California and brought this cult to people. I find it fascinating. Anytime there's this kind of story of someone from somewhere else, some outsider, some traveler brings this new information to a group of people and they totally engage in it and it starts to change their culture. Down in Peru, they have a similar, individual. Viracocha is kind of the name. And then in this rural area of Ollantaytambo down in Peru, outside of Cusco, in between Cusco and Machu Picchu, Tanumpa is this giant megalith carved into the side of the head. And they say the same kinds of things, is that this individual brought them culture, agriculture, taught them these things. So these stories of someone coming in and changing culture are very common in these native places. So Kuksu, I've heard from that basically created a secret society out of it, but ultimately that they could control through this cult kind of, worship and ceremony, bringing kind of the world back into a pure state and return all the living beings back into this world of pure state. Again, this is a little bit of that, supernatural, obviously kind of contagious, sympathetic magic combination of those two put into a ceremony and a secret society kind of coming out of that and blending those together. The ghost dance, again, we start to get in the 1870s and then again in the 1890s, this Native American revitalization movement where taking pride in your Native ancestry and your history is important, and to bring back this kind of balance to the universe of Native Americans and the natural world. And it's to the point where, it got into some interesting things where we start to get into some native groups thinking that they were invincible, and because of this kind of dance, and starts to really, again, the ghost dance is one of those things that sweeps through all of Native American cultures. Really, it's kind of becomes this gasp for, hey, what can we do? How can we control this? And they go back to their old ways and their old religious ways of, hey, this is how we used to do things in terms of world renewal. Let's try this again. And they go through the ghost dance and process during this time as well. California natives today, I might not have changed the picture out. 80,000 Native Americans, Native Californians. There's like over 300,000 Native Americans in California. But if you talk to a lot of people, they're from, Cherokee, right? There's a lot of Midwest tribal people that have moved to California. So 80,000 Native Californians, which is a bit scary because if we look at pre-contact, there might have even been from 300,000 to 1 million people here, natives. So that number has dwindled in a big way. Reservations, there's about 600,000 acres dedicated to rancherias or reservations. Again, put aside. 50 other California groups have applied for federal recognition. That's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. I know the Native American group Where I'm from, again, that San Juan Bautista area, the Munson Ohlone. There's this place called Indian Canyon off of Cienega Road. They've kind of bought it out as private property, and it's kind of in this mode. But I know that they've kind of applied for federal status, and a bunch of others have too, in terms of lumping groups and making larger groups, kind of a conglomerate is in this area. Remember, the California natives were so diverse and kind of right next to each other that a lot of them have teamed up in this kind of application. So they do like two tribal names together to try to boost their kind of recognition. Again, as you guys know, if you live here, Indian casinos have been popularized and growing. They tend to increase, giving back obviously money to these reservations and Native Americans. They've also opened up tax-free tobacco shops. And then more recently, I've heard them kind of moving into the marijuana industry. Remember, once we recognize them as reservations, they are sovereign nations themselves. So they're in charge of their own laws, their police force, all of these things. And they're kind of on their own to do, what they wish or what they will. So again, one of the other things that your book talks about is that there hasn't really been done, much ethnographic work since the 1970s on Native Californians. We might be, and again, I think it would probably be beneficial for us to look at culture change, to do some ethnography around Native Americans or Native Californians who have been involved in the casino industry and some of these other things. I mean, that's a pertinent ethnography, to try to pull out some interesting information and phenomenon around that policy structure and how they're adapting and passing on native traditions, but then have this kind of casino apparatus, very capitalistic kind of system on the side. Anyway, there's a lot of potential ethnographies there, in my mind, especially. So any of you future anthropologists out there that want to kind of stay close to home in California, I'm sure that there's plenty of work to be done. It hasn't really been updated in a long time. These are the two groups that you're going to be looking at in terms of the case studies at the end. This is a mock-up of what the Chumash would have looked like on the coast there. This is kind of their typical dwelling. And then you have their boats. They're out in the ocean, obviously harpooning fish, spearing fish. The Yukuts and the Chumash, and you're going to want to focus again on their economics, cosmology, religion and medicine, material culture, social, political organization, language, and life cycle. Remember, cosmology is something that's fascinating, especially when we start to look at all these different groups, and how much environmental determinism is part of that, right? How much of nature and the environment are part of their creation story, which is fascinating because when you get into the subarctic, they're so reliant on the dog, up in the Arctic, right? And the dog becomes part of their creation story, whereas we get down into California and it's more about the coyote and nature, and the dog's not necessarily as important or part of our cosmology. So yeah, kind of focus on those things. That pretty much does it for the week. Again, the Ishi videos is quite long, but if you guys can make it through, I mean, there are a decent amount of very depressing things about this. And I go into that in terms of how I want you to kind of respond to the discussion post. Kind of going back to last week's, discussion a little bit. And, when I was asking about, do you judge microculture or your own people in your culture, in terms of Americans and what they did in the past? Again, judging is tough, but can we do some critical analysis? Yes, we can. But again, anthropologists, and I touch on this in this week's post, anthropologists tend to be humanists and really focus on human rights and, those rights of not being injured or harmed or killed or tortured, as a basic right, being born on this planet. Ultimately, they would say should ensure that we do not have this. Remember, a lot of anthropologists tend to be culturally relative until that culture is not culturally relative, right? When they start to get kind of in that judgy. And I know, I think some individuals have pointed out this kind of intolerance for intolerance, right? The idea would be at an educational level to kind of spread the idea of cultural relativity so that none of the intolerance has to actually happen. But again, make sure that you kind of focus in on that piece. And, again, anthropologists fall on the spectrum depending on what topic we're talking about, right? And most topics anthropologists tend to be culturally relative. When you get into some of those other harming, torturous things, then they tend to be more ethnocentric. So that's it for the week. Again, I'm enjoying the discussion posts, so keep them up.